Only the assets they currently cared about were worth planning for. Everything else didn't matter. So I asked one more question, and I admit I was being a little snarky here. I said, well, if there really isn't anything else worth having, then why not just name me as the beneficiary of everything that's not listed? And that's when the conversation paused. Because now we're not just talking about theory anymore. Now we're talking about real consequences. There is a certain type of estate plan that clients will describe as simple. And every time I hear it, I already know where this is going. Because what sounds simple on the surface turns into something far more complicated once you look at how it actually works over time. I've started using a framework to explain this because once you see it, the problem becomes obvious. I call it the DEFCON scale. Difficult estate format chaos overload number. And what we're really measuring here is not how complicated your life is, not how many kids you have, whether or not you're in a second marriage. What we're measuring is how complicated you've made the structure of your estate plan based on how you're distributing your assets. At DEFCON 1, everything is clean and percentage based. You're leaving your estate to your beneficiaries either equally per stirpes or equally per capita, or even different percentages, and you're not trying to micromanage individual assets. Maybe you've got a personal property memorandum for some smaller items, but the core of your plan is simple and flexible. It doesn't matter what specific assets you own at the time of your death, the plan still works. Probate attorneys don't like this information getting out because it makes people wonder whether probate really is a big deal or not. If this sounds different from what you were told, please leave a comment. And if you want more straight answers, like and subscribe. At DEFCON 2, you're still mostly using percentages, but you've carved out one of two specific items going here or there. A very common example is an inherited account from one side of the family. Maybe one spouse says, well, if I die first, I want this particular account of my inheritance to go directly to my children and not to my spouse. Look, that's fine. That's not a big deal. That's a reasonable exception. But the rest of the estate is still handled by percentages. At DEFCON 3, you start assigning a few larger assets. Maybe a property goes to one child, a brokerage account goes to another, and then everything else is still divided by percentages. It's still workable, but you're starting to introduce some rigidity into that plan, and certainly there's going to be some updates as assets change. Now, at DEFCON 4, most of the estate is now being assigned asset by asset. There's a list. This property goes here. That account goes there. This investment goes to this person. And then whatever is left over, the remainder, is comparatively small and goes by percentages. At this point, you've created a plan that is going to need updates if you sell property, change accounts, or shift your financial structure. And then we get to DEFCON 5. This is where everything is parceled out. Every property, every account, every major asset is assigned to specific people or a group of people. And then on top of that, each of those assignments may have their own contingent plans for beneficiaries. If this person dies, sometimes it goes to their children, other times it goes to some other completely different people, or it goes to these other people and then their descendants, but not others. There's no consistent structure. And whatever is left over, if anything is left over, goes to what I call the who cares beneficiaries. Next of kin, charities, whoever, because the client doesn't think that asset was important enough to plan specifically for, so why bother? That's DEFCON 5, and that's where things break. Let me give you a real example. I was working with a married couple in a second marriage. Each had children from prior relationships. So far, very normal. They each created their own trust because their plans were different enough that they needed to do that. They controlled their own assets and they named their own beneficiaries. They also agreed on a couple of specific provisions for one or two properties that If one of them passed on, the surviving spouse could continue to use those properties for the rest of their life. And then after both of them had passed on, okay, those properties would go to their respective children. That part went well. No issue there. When things started to go in completely different directions was how each spouse wanted to handle the rest of their estate. One spouse took what I call the DEFCON 1 approach. After dealing with those specific property provisions, everything else went to their children equally per stirpes. Clean, flexible, durable. If they changed banks, if they sold a property, if they opened a new account, it didn't matter. The plan would still work exactly the way it was supposed to. The other spouse refused to do that. They did not want to use percentages at all. Instead, they wanted to go through every single asset they owned and assigned it to a specific person. Every property, every bank account, every investment account, everything had to be individually listed and individually directed. And it didn't stop there. For some of those assets, the beneficiary passed away, it would go to that person's children. For other assets, if the beneficiary passed away, it would go to completely different individuals. There was no consistent logic across the plan. It was just a growing list of instructions for each and every asset. So I asked a very simple question. I said, what happens to everything else? And the response I got was immediate. I don't own anything else. Now, I hear that more often than you would think, but it's always the same issue. Estate planning is not about what you own today and only today. It's about creating a structure that will still work years from now when all of that may have changed. So I pointed that out. I said, accounts change, people switch banks, investment companies get bought, you might consolidate accounts, you might open new accounts. And the response was, I'm never going to do that. I'm never going to change banks. Well, that's a strong statement, and it's almost never true. So I tried a different approach. I said, you mentioned you're planning to get some new appliances. Who gets those? And then I was told you're being ridiculous. Because in their mind, only the assets they currently cared about were worth planning for. Everything else didn't matter. So I asked one more question, and I admit I was being a little snarky here. I said, well, if there really isn't anything else worth having, then why not just name me as the beneficiary of everything that's not listed? And that's when the conversation paused. Because now we're not just talking about theory anymore. Now we're talking about real consequences. They didn't want to leave me everything that was left over, but they weren't even seeing there was a leftover until we got to that point. If you refuse to plan for the unknown, then you're leaving those assets to outcomes you probably would never intentionally choose. And that's the core problem with this DEFCON 5 planning. It feels precise, it feels controlled, it feels like you're covering everything. But that only works if nothing changes, and nothing ever stays the same. Accounts get closed, new assets are acquired, properties are sold, people move money, beneficiaries pass away. Life happens. And when your entire plan is built on assigning specific assets instead of using a flexible structure, every one of those changes becomes a problem. Not a minor adjustment, a real problem that requires you to go back and redo the plan. What was supposed to be simple turns into constant maintenance. By contrast, when you're at DEFCON 1, the plan absorbs those changes automatically because it's based on percentages of the overall estate. It doesn't matter what the specific assets are, the structure holds. You can still make specific bequests. You can still carve out a few exceptions when it makes sense, but those should be the exception, not the foundation of the entire plan. Because the goal here is not to create a perfect list of everything today. The goal is to create a plan that still works when your life inevitably changes. And if your plan requires you to update it every time you open a new account, every time you sell a property, every time you replace something in your house, that's not simplicity. That's DEFCON 5. If you're not sure where your plan falls on this scale, or you're starting to realize it might be more complicated than it needs to be, I walk through this in plain English in my free course. It will help you understand how to structure your estate plan so it actually works over time instead of needing constant fixes. You can check out that free course at freetrustcourse.com. And as I always tell my clients, please stay safe, plan ahead, and enjoy life. And whatever you do, make it a great day.